So every year the Christian calendar ends with the triumphant vision of Christ the King. That was last Sunday. Then, the following Sunday, we begin a brand new liturgical year on Advent 1. That's today. I am guessing that many of us begin Advent with a vaguely Christmassy feeling. It's not quite Christmas, but it feels like things should at least be getting slightly Christmassy as we head into December. We're longing for carols or candles. Evergreen plants definitely should be involved. And yet, every single year, our lectionary instead insists that we begin the liturgical year with the apocalypse. As the flood unexpectedly swept away the people in the time of Noah, so too will be the coming of the Son of Man, says our gospel lesson. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. The Son of Man is coming like a thief in the night. Merry Advent, everyone. Why start our year in this way, with this kind of imagery? I mean, what in the world is Jesus actually talking about? So I grew up in a branch of the Christian family tree which had a very solid answer to that question. Growing up in a fundamentalist evangelical church, I was taught that this passage is about the rapture. If you are unfamiliar with the doctrine of the rapture, you're in good company. It's a 19th century invention which never really spread far beyond the boundaries of the evangelical world. But in that evangelical world, let me tell you, it is a very, very big deal. Essentially, the doctrine of the rapture says that if you take a handful of selected passages from across the New Testament, today's gospel lesson being one of them, and if you arrange those particular verses in the right way, kind of like a divine jigsaw puzzle, what you will get is the literal description of a coming day when Jesus will literally descend from the literal clouds, and the true Christians will be taken up into the literal sky to join him. And then, kind of like a cosmic parent picking up the kids from school, Jesus will take the faithful off into heaven while the world below falls into absolute chaos and destruction. And if you are one of the many, many people who miss out on that rapture moment, if you are not spiritually ready for Jesus when he comes, the logic goes, then you are doomed to go down into destruction with the now literally God-forsaken earth. That, I can tell you, is a heavy narrative to lay on a grade schooler. So I grew up expecting that the end of the world could come at pretty much any moment. The world I lived in was perpetually dangling by the very thinnest of threads, with the potential to fall any second. I remember distinctly as a junior high school student wondering if the world would last at least until I could graduate from high school, because it seemed like it would be a shame to do all this homework for nothing. It was an intensely anxious way to live, I can tell you. The earliest Christians did not quite have the idea of the rapture, but they did suspect that the end of the world might well be coming very, very soon. Jesus had unexpectedly revealed God in a radical new way, and the first generation of Christians were left struggling to understand what it meant that God had walked among humanity, died, and then somehow returned from the dead. It felt a bit like the sort of thing God might do as a final act, just before the curtain closes on history. We see some of this thinking in today's reading from Paul's letter to the Romans, where Paul says, "The night is far gone, the day is near, so essentially straighten up and live properly. We do not have much time left." Yet a funny thing happens across the letters of the New Testament, which cover a span of many decades historically. The early church shifts from feeling that the end is just around the corner to instead decide that they need to settle in, create stable communities, and commit to doing Christ's will within this world while they wait for a future which is known only to God, not them. They come to terms with the idea that the last day may not be just around the corner. The end of something had certainly come, but so, they discover, had a new beginning. That idea, the end is near, but so is the beginning. That is Advent in a nutshell. That is also what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel. And it turns out that that passage really is a warning, and it really does have something to say about the future, even if it is not talking about a literal rapture into the sky. To understand what Jesus is saying, we have to back up to the beginning of Matthew chapter 24. Today's reading comes from later in that same chapter. The chapter begins with Jesus telling his disciples that the massive temple complex in Jerusalem, a structure which seems utterly immovable and permanent, the center of the universe, that it will one day be thrown down into ruins. And the day when this crisis will happen, says Jesus, is coming much faster than they think. In Jesus' time, resentment of Roman colonial rule was reaching a fever pitch. Revolutionaries had taken to the hills, violence was escalating, Rome was ratcheting up their attempts to squash any potential challenge to their authority. Doomsday preachers and popular agitators were a regular feature in the temple courtyards and public squares. Things were building to a bloody climax. Jesus warned his followers not to throw in with the coming revolution. Jesus made clear that his kingdom was not the kind of kingdom which arrives on the point of a sword. Jesus' kingdom would arrive by other means. The day Jesus warned his followers about finally came in 70 CE, about 40 years after the crucifixion. The uprising began in earnest, and the Romans brutally crushed it, tearing down the temple and massacring much of the population of Jerusalem in the process. That is the event Jesus is telling his followers to prepare for. That is the moment when they are to head to the hills rather than take up weapons. The dark and terrible day when the temple ends will also be the beginning of a new era as the Jerusalem church spreads out into all the world. The end will be a beginning. Jesus is speaking here in a highly poetic literary form which was popular in his day, a genre known as apocalyptic. Matthew chapters 24 and 25 are actually known to biblical scholars by the name the Little Apocalypse. Apocalyptic borrowed a lot of imagery from the earlier prophets of Israel, but it stretched this imagery in all sorts of imaginative new directions. Earlier in this chapter, Jesus uses imagery like the sun darkening, stars falling from the sky, cosmic trumpets being blown by angels, and so on. This is the way apocalyptic tells a dramatic story to draw the complete attention of listeners. Frequently, apocalyptic literature works by moving outward from a poetic riff on a current or historical event, like a military invasion or a natural disaster, towards an even more imaginative vision of the future. Rapture theology is what you get when you try to read this stuff as literal forecasting. But if you instead stay within the ancient literary mode, you will notice something very different is going on. Apocalyptic is talking about the future in order to reveal something which is hard to notice about the present moment. We don't have a direct parallel to the apocalyptic genre today, but I would say science fiction is probably closest. What do I mean by that? Let us consider Star Trek. In 1966, Gene Roddenberry created a TV series about the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. The show centers on the command crew of this starship as they deal with all kinds of mysterious aliens and dangerous encounters on strange new worlds. The show is set in the 23rd century, but here's the thing. Star Trek is not really about the future. Remember, the series was released in 1966. The command crew of the Enterprise who work together to solve all these problems includes pilots who are Russian and Japanese. It includes a black woman as the primary communications and technology officer. It showcases people of different races, nationalities, and genders treating one another with respect. An awful lot of the worlds they encounter are facing crises reminiscent of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, or Vietnam. Did Roddenberry really think the future would have funky starships that looked like the Enterprise? Did he really think that aliens would look suspiciously like people with their skin painted bright colors and bits of rubber stuck on their foreheads and or ears? Was that really his point? Years after the series aired, Roddenberry said, quote, "By creating a new world with new rules, I could make statements about sex, religion, Vietnam, politics, and intercontinental missiles. If you talked about purple people on a far-off planet, the television network never really caught on." Roddenberry was clear about his goals. He wanted folks to imagine a future where people, regardless of differences, respected one another and worked together. He wanted folks to see a future where wealth inequality had been completely eradicated. He wanted folks to think about how the decisions they were making right now might be leading towards or away from that future. In this respect, Roddenberry is a bit like today's reading from the prophet Isaiah. When Isaiah spoke his vision of a future where nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, he was providing a vision meant to both comfort and challenge the people of Israel in his time. He was also laying one of the earliest building stones of the apocalyptic genre. That is how apocalyptic works. It's a vision of the future, but it's really about what we choose to do right now. Jesus warned his followers about a coming event, but he was also telling them how to live in the present moment. Jesus was making a larger point about our relationship with the future. It is coming faster than we think, so we need to wake up and act like it. That is what Jesus is pointing at with all this talk about Noah's flood and unexpected break-ins. Things cannot go on forever as they now are. There are consequences to what we do with the present moment, and those consequences will arrive sooner and more suddenly than we would like. As we look at the rising tide of environmental disasters, economic inequality, increasingly open racism and anti-Semitism, vicious, life-taking homophobia, and political polarization, can we really doubt that long-delayed consequences, a day of judgment, as the Bible might put it, has in fact arrived? We are a bit like the folks in Noah's day, long ignoring God's call while clinging to our familiar routines. Yet the floodwaters are here. Just ask the people in Florida. The word apocalyptic comes from a Greek word which means to reveal something which is hidden. The point of the jarring, disturbing imagery of apocalyptic is to wake the listener up so they will notice something critical. It's Gene Roddenberry using purple aliens to get folks to think about racism or the anti-war movement. They would tune him out if he just stood there and preached at them. But once you add in some lasers and Leonard Nimoy and a space wig, you have got people's attention. And once those people are faced with the important idea underneath all the spaceships and teleporters, they can't unsee it. Why are the aliens with purple skin being treated so badly anyway? That doesn't seem fair. The point of apocalyptic is not to keep people locked in perpetual trauma, like poor teenage me wondering if I ought to do my homework because the world is coming to an end. Apocalyptic isn't meant to make us give up on the world. It's not made to make us try to escape it. Apocalyptic is designed to do precisely the opposite, to get us to stop drifting with the status quo and actually orient our lives towards what we say matters. It wants us to face things that we are currently tuning out. It wants us to recognize that frightening change, including judgment on the evils we as a society have failed to address, is coming, and that our choices right now will shape how we experience that unavoidable oncoming reality. Jesus is here on Advent 1, shaking us with the words of Matthew's little apocalypse and saying, snap out of it. See the signs all around you. Time may be short, but there is still time left. See this new liturgical year for the precious gift it actually is. The Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The end is near, but so is the beginning.